Okay. Alexander Tuttle asked a question on packback about the difference between my argument and Watson's argument, and I argued that a big reason for the surge in land purchases from 1814 to 1820 was wheat, the export of wheat and flour to Europe at war. And Watson's explanation for this, up to 1819, is that it is cotton. And so it's an interesting question. And his question was, who's right? Who's responsible? Are there more people settling in wheat regions, or are there more people settling in cotton regions in this period? It's a great question, and one that my first go-to is research. So I went to this book called The Land Office Business by William Rohrbaugh. It's quite an old book, but there's not another book on the land office business in the last 30 years. It's about 30 years old, and he doesn't have an answer to the problem. So I had to noodle around a little bit. And I found, by some quick Googling and thinking through how the land office works and stuff like that, I found this table, which is land sales up to 1823. So it's a little bit past the period that we're talking about. So it's through the crash and after. But land sales, as you know, dropped precipitously after 1819. And this is all the money that's received by the General Land Office for lands. And as you can see, where that is Ohio and Indiana, drastically outdo Mississippi and Alabama in terms of land sales. So roughly $9 million collected in land sales from Ohio and Indiana over the decade between 1813 and 1823. And that is, so Ohio is more than 10 times Alabama and more than 30 times Mississippi in terms of land sales. So I win. Honestly though, it's a good question, but it's true. So I don't want to underestimate the role of land sales, because remember that boom and bust that we see in cotton prices does lead to a boom and bust in the sale of people, and also a boom and bust in the sale of land. So the South is part of this boom and bust, is definitely part of this boom and bust cycle. But if we're looking at total land sales, Ohio fever is much more important than Mississippi and Alabama fever. So a question, what are some of the topics your point of view differs from Watson's relating to what we've learned recently? One of them would be the cause of the Panic of 1819. Mine has everything to do with the British response to American tariff barriers. Another one would be the Panic of 1837. So Watson sees the Panic of 1819 as being in part a boom and bust in cotton. I'll have to go back and look at precisely what he says there. But he sees the Panic of 1819 as a kind of an example of the market revolution, people being burned by the market revolution. That's for him the crucial issue. For me, that's, I think, too simplistic an explanation, and that it has much more to do with international trade and the boom and bust in international trade. Today is going to be a good example, the comparison between me and Watson, because I don't think there was a market revolution in the 1820s. I don't think the 1820s was that different from the 1790s or the 1770s in terms of how it is that people dealt with an international market. But I think that the really important period of change that takes place is the 1840s up to 1848. And that here, what we see is a drastic transformation between North and South economically. So we talked about politically the way in which the second party system is designed to paper over any differences between North and South, right? We'll argue about tariffs. We'll argue about internal improvements, that is canals and things like that to the west. We'll argue about the power of a central government. We'll even argue about Indian removal. Democrats tended to favor Indian removal. Whigs tended to be offended by Indian removal. But they won't talk about slavery. Democrats and Whigs will not talk about slavery because it's a dividing line between North and South, and they see it as a ticket to civil war, right? Fighting, arguing politically, publicly about slavery is being very dangerous. But I want to suggest through the 1840s, what we see is an increasingly sharp divide economically between those two regions. And I just heard this word, and I'm not sure it's really, I don't like the word, but anyways, there's a term called geoeconomics, which is used by people in geopolitics to talk about the relationship between geography and economics. And I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, geoeconomics today and the difference between North and South. Yes, the exam is Friday, and the syllabus, it says Monday. Okay. Okay. First of all, some definitions. One is hinterland. And a hinterland is a rural region that surrounds an urban area, tied to that urban area by trade. Originally, that definition had everything to do with the natural features of a landscape. So if a place was on a river, its hinterland was bigger because it was easier to bring rural goods into the city and easier to bring city goods, manufactured goods, out to those rural regions. Does that make sense? The places along a river, you've got an area kind of circle around a city where the food comes into the city and then the manufactured goods go out. But if you're on a river, it's longer, right? The hinterland is longer because it's easier to get further away to those rural regions. Does that make sense? Hinterlands, by the 1840s, become transformed in part by, so in the 1820s and 30s, they become transformed by canals. By the 1840s, they become transformed by railroads. And railroads drastically change the landscape because they expand the hinterland. And you can see this if you look at a journey from the East Coast, this is from New York, to other places. And to get from New York to the Mississippi River in 1800 takes 5 weeks. Sorry, it's cut off at the bottom there. In 1800. By 1830, it's 2 weeks. To get from New York to western Pennsylvania, where Pittsburgh is, you see that like right below where it says Lake Ontario. It takes 2 weeks to get from New York to Pittsburgh in 1800. It takes 3 days to get to New York, from New York to Pittsburgh by 1830, right? So railroads are the things that are changing that hinterland. Now there are public roads and there are canals and there are steamboats, so all these things are important. Steamboats, of course, make it easy to go back and forth up the Mississippi River, but railroads are the crucial thing. Repeat the definition of hinterland. Hinterland is the rural region that surrounds an urban region. So a good question would be, was there a market revolution in the 18-teens and 1820s? I want to suggest no, there was a market revolution in the 1830s and 1840s. Okay, so railroads are the things that do this, and railroads are initially built by merchants who are in a city. If you think about it, people who are in a city want to expand their hinterland because they want to have more access to farmers in the West, right? They want to have more places that they can sell pots and nails and fertilizer and those sorts of things too, and they want more places that they can buy wheat and flour and cotton from, and so they will pay for a railroad to extend their hinterland further out to the west. By 1857, you can see that this increases even further. The hinterland increases even further, so that New York's hinterland, as you can see, goes all the way to Ohio. It's a one-day travel from New York to Ohio, when it had previously been 3 to 4 weeks. Most railroads are not, most railroads don't pass through multiple states. They only pass through one state, and in part that's because they have state charters. And the state charters are, give somebody a right to have a kind of monopoly railroad corridor along a route, and states give those charters. And as you can imagine, North Carolina would not want a railroad that starts in North Carolina and ends in Richmond. Georgia is not going to want a railroad that starts in Atlanta and ends in Charleston. And so while this looks like a continuous road from Atlanta to Charleston, in fact, it stops at that river there, right at the border, and there's a new railroad that goes on the other side. Okay, so that's the definition of a hinterland, and the hinterland expands. The other definition that's important is what are called backward and forward linkages. And this is from developmental economics. And what are backward and forward linkages? For any major crop that's grown in a region, the backward linkages are the things that go into making it, the goods that go into making it. Plows, so if we look at wheat, for example, we talk about plows, nails, fertilizer, right? Each of those things you need, plows and fertilizer are the most obvious. Nails are a little more confusing, but you need nails to build a house, to build a barn, to build those sorts of things. And the more wheat that you grow, the more likely you're going to need nails to expand into those regions. Clothing is even more, a little bit more remote, but again, it's an important backward linkage because the more crop that's grown in a region, the more people that settle in that region to grow that crop, the more they need these other goods to produce goods, to produce that major good. And when I say it's a major good, I'm not just saying that most of the stuff that goes from west to east is wheat and corn. 90% of the goods that go from west to east is wheat and corn. There's almost nothing else that travels along these railroads except the commodity. Likewise, cotton. Cotton goes from Alabama and Mississippi to the coast, and it's something like, it's over 90% that goes along that railroad from the hinterland to the urban center. Okay, so a backward linkage are the things that go into making that thing. A forward linkage is a further processing of that good. And so with wheat, we talk about wheat exchanges, that is places where people buy and sell wheat, just like the London Metal Exchange that collapsed 2 days ago. There were corn and flour exchanges, wheat exchanges in every major city in the East in the 1840s and 1850s. There are flour mills that take the wheat and turn it into flour. There are bakeries that take the flour and turn it into bread. There are distilleries that take wheat and turn it into alcohol. And there are restaurants, the kind of final piece of this. And those are all forward linkages, further processing of that good. Benjamin Franklin Newcomer is the best example, kind of suggests some of these things. He's in Baltimore. He is and suggests this sort of changing nature of business, particularly in northern cities. Lots of industries can make their hinterlands. He was a general merchant in Baltimore who started trading every kind of good, wheat, tobacco, coffee, and corn. Benjamin's father, he was born in 1827, Benjamin's father had been a general merchant, and in 1842, his father formed an association with Samuel Stonebreaker, and they became wholesale flour dealers in flour and grain. So all they did was get flour and grain from the hinterland. And Benjamin Franklin, newcomer, worked in his father's firm from the age of 16. He never went to college. He learned everything there is to know about grain and flour, how weather would affect the crop, where the best grain comes from, and where prices are highest. They worked 2 seasons, winter and fall wheat, coming from different regions west of Maryland. For many years, they sold 1/10 of all the flour in Baltimore. Maryland is becoming a free state in part because enslaved people are being carried down from Maryland to other slave states, and in part because wheat is the primary product that's grown in Maryland. At age 18, in 1845, Benjamin Franklin Newcomer purchased his dad's interest, and then in 1848, he married the daughter of one of the earliest stockholders of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Connections to her gave the Newcomer family access to other merchants and bankers in Baltimore. She puts on the parties. They visit the opera, they visit charity balls, and she builds his network with other capitalists. Benjamin Franklin Newcomer becomes promoted to the Corn and Flour Exchange in 1853. Newcomer is one of the wealthiest people on the East Coast by the 1850s. And he makes his money on what's called the change, or the Corn and Flour Exchange. Here, other people's money goes into speculation on future prices. You buy a contract to get grain 6 months from now from a farmer in Western Maryland, right? You offer him an advance on the wheat that he's going to produce. He's going to use that money that's given to him to invest in parts and seed and things like that, maybe expand his acreage. You take that contract and you sell it on the Corn and Flour Exchange. Who buys it? Flour millers buy it, right? Because they want to know they want to buy the grain in advance, knowing that they're going to get it in 6 months. It's signed by the farmer, and it's signed by the merchant, somebody like Newcomer. So you know that the grain is going to arrive on May 1st or June 1st. But then other people can buy this too, can buy these contracts. And these contracts are bought and sold in Baltimore by other people who think the price is going to rise. Or they're bought by people who think the price is going to rise, and then they discover that it was actually a really great season, and then they'll quickly sell it. So that the price of the wheat, the contract has gone up, and they can sell it before the price of the contract goes down. There's a daily price for this wheat, depending on what people think is going to happen in the market over time. Does that make sense? It's like the stock market. It's before, there's not really, there is a stock market in the United States, but the flour exchange is where all of the, speculation is taking place. And people gamble, really, literally gamble on this. But people also make a lot of money by knowing stuff about the grain. So initially, Newcomer made his money by knowing when to plant, what a rainy season meant, what a dry season meant in terms of the price of wheat. But ultimately, he turns it over to the flour exchange and lets other people invest in this. Does this make sense? Right? Lets other people speculate on the price of. He just makes his money as a percentage of all of those transactions that come in. This is the exchange, an image of the exchange in the 1850s. And as you can see, these are mostly wealthy men. To get onto the Corn and Flour Exchange, you needed to pay something like $200 a year to be on the Corn and Flour Exchange. It allowed you to watch what was going on with these prices. There's a Newcomer Museum in Baltimore. Newcomer, it's one of the most important museums on the East Coast after the Museum of Modern Art. It's because Newcomer bought a lot of art. He was fabulously wealthy, in large part by these transactions. And so the people that are emerging in places like this in the north, and that's from Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, are a group of people who wear top hats, who we would call businessmen. And they're distinct by their collars, their white collars, which are a paper collar that's replaced every day. And the collar represents the fact that they don't have to work for a living. They dress in a jacket like this one, I guess. I bought this jacket in 2008 in the downturn. There were 3 Hugo Boss jackets. I got them for $50. And when they arrived, they turned out to come from a funeral home. So it's a little disturbing. You wonder, they did not smell of formaldehyde or anything like that. But they wore suits like this. A middle-class family is not somebody who is on the exchange, but this is somebody who is like a scrivener, like Herman Melville was. Somebody who records transactions for a merchant. Someone who balances the book for a merchant. Someone who writes letters and responds to letters from a merchant. The secretary. Secretary was mostly men in the 19th century. And these people are the middle class. There's an emerging middle class in these urban cities in wheat regions in the north. And here they are posed probably with their dead child. It's common in the 1830s and 1840s, if you had a child that died, that you would, to remember the child, you would take a picture before they were buried. In any event. So the child's not asleep. The child is probably dead. Sorry, this took a dark turn. White-collar newspaper men, or people who are following the news. They're learning about the prices of these goods. The reason people buy newspapers initially is just to look at page 2 or page 3, which has the various prices of butter and wheat and flour and those other sorts of goods. But they also provide other information that's important, that tells you what's going to happen with butter and wheat and flour, including things like the weather, but also tensions, taxes, tariffs, all these other sorts of things that might affect that market. Many people in the city, whether they're middle class or upper class, have a sense of what is going on with that market. This is what the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, all of those newspapers, the business section of the New York Times, all of those newspapers carry on that tradition. But this is largely what emerges from this. Where are we in terms of time? Okay, I'm going to jump over this. And finally, there's a working class. And the working class, they don't wear white collars. They wear bibs and aprons. This is a cooper, somebody who makes barrels. And while the middle-class readers tended to read newspapers, so they also read novels. Let me go back for a second. Like The Scarlet Letter, one of the most famous novels of the 1850s, The House of Seven Gables, another famous novel, both of them about the plight of a middle-class person, basically the up and downs of their own fortunes. Workers also read, this was a highly literate society in the United States, white workers also read, and white and black workers in northern cities did, and they read the penny press, things like The Sun, and they read dime novels, not the expensive hardcover novels like House of Seven Gables. They read dime novels like this one, The Black Princess, or The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk. The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk are a story about a Catholic girl who is brought into a monastery, not a monastery, a convent, and is raped by the priests, has a child. The child is buried secretly in a grave, and there's a grave filled with, God, this is, sorry, I didn't realize this was going to be so grim. The grave in Montreal that's supposedly filled with all these babies that are produced in the convent. This is kind of made up. I mean, this is not actually what a Montreal convent looks like. But these sensationalistic novels were the things that mostly workers read, men and women. Okay, but if we look at the South, we see a different kind of hinterland. And in that hinterland, we see mostly plantations. If we count the people, many more African American people are on plantations, and there's only one buyer on that plantation. Most of the rest of the people on the plantation don't have regular access to money. It's not true that they don't have any access to money. They are buying and selling some food and stuff like that enslaved women are growing crops and sometimes selling them in town, but for most major purchases, one person is making the purchase for a group of 50. Dead baby's important to lecture, noted, yes, okay. By comparison, what we see in the wheat regions, so in cotton regions, we see plantations that are established. Most plantations are large, 200 or more acres. Most plantations, that is not most plantations, but most enslaved people are on large plantations. They have 50 or more enslaved people on them, but they only have one or two buyers for a group of 50. In wheat regions, this is Cleveland, Ohio, what we see is a much more diverse and complicated downtown. We see a downtown without a downtown in a place like Mobile, or a downtown in a place like Atlanta, has 3 or 4 stores, literally 3 or 4 stores. A downtown in a place like Cleveland has 50 stores, has competing stores, a downtown street with many buyers and sellers and regular two-way traffic. But why does that matter? It doesn't matter for the crop, but it does matter for railroads. Because railroads are bringing those crops from the hinterland to the city, but southern railroads go back empty because enslavers are not buying that much. Cleveland, Ohio, you've got all these stores that are buying and selling things that mostly it's the stuff you get at Bed Bath & Beyond, mostly plates and dishes, also the stuff you get at Ace Hardware. Scissors, knives, what else? Nails, plows. You can't buy a plow at either Bed Bath & Beyond or at Ace Hardware, but that general idea of kind of hardware goods, a lot of those goods are flowing back over the same railroads. But they're not flowing back over these other regions. So let's look at the forward linkages. The backward linkages are more or less the same. So the backward linkages, plows, nails, fertilizer, they're the same. But those goods are only bought once a year when the cotton comes in. Not multiple times of the year when a family needs them. There's not as much of a credit market for the cotton. People buy pork barrels. People buy salt. There are these things called Negro brogans, which are shoes that are cheaply made for enslaved people, but a box of them, one large box of them, will be enough for a plantation for a year. The forward linkages, cotton pressing, and that's it. Cotton mills are mostly in New England. Clothing manufacturers are mostly in New York. And so the forward linkages and backward linkages of cotton in a system of slavery are very different. There's not as much urban development on the East Coast because there aren't as many forward linkages. And there isn't as much urban development in the hinterland because there aren't as many backward linkages. Does that make sense? This is question here. So the reason wheat markets exceed cotton markets in terms of sales is due to more market for wheat products and more often harvest? No, the real reason is the backward and forward linkages for wheat are much more complicated. So what you can have, let's, oh gosh, I'm sorry about this is like the muddiest picture ever. But let's imagine a universe of 150 people, just to kind of get a sense of what's going on here. And in a universe of 150 people, in a small town, what we're going to see is 37 buyers and 37 sellers in a place like Ohio or Indiana, a place where a lot of land is being sold, with multiple competing stores and those purple blobs. You know, I'm not so great at images, it turns out. Larger cities are going to be on the East Coast, and bigger towns are going to be on the West Coast. In the South, we're going to see smaller cities because there aren't as many forward linkages, and there's not as much hinterland trade. There's not as much goods going from the east to the west because there's not as much purchasing. There are, in a universe of 150, there are only 10 buyers and 10 sellers because many of those places have plantations. And a large household might have one buyer for 50 producers. And so we're going to see only a few stores. So what does that mean? It's not volume from west to east. That's basically the same. It's volume east to west. And a railroad that goes back empty, which is what happens to most railroads in the South, is that they fail because they have to charge twice as much to send goods from west to east, right? And then they go back empty. And a railroad has to have the same cars that are going back and forth. And so there are all these railroads that are built in the 1840s, and all of them fail. Almost all of them fail. So there is a North Carolina railroad, there is a South Carolina railroad, there is a Richmond and Danville railroad. But most of them fail financially because they don't have a middle class, right? They don't have a middle class market. They don't have a middle class market in the hinterland, and they don't have a middle class market in the cities. And that poisons the well in cotton regions because railroads don't work. Can I repeat what had more backward linkages and what had more forward linkages? Wheat has more forward linkages because you're turning that wheat into bread, to flour. You're turning the flour into bread. When you grind up the wheat, you get the white flour, and then you get what's called the middlings, which is the kind of wheat germ and wheat bran and stuff like that. You can't travel very far. It spoils very easily, but it's perfect for feeding pigs and cows with. And so you can have pigs and cows in cities because the flour mills just generate all this bran that has to be eaten right away. So what you get is the proliferation of superheated cities, very big cities, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and bigger towns in the West, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Dayton, Ohio. And by the 1840s, northern cities are much bigger than southern cities. Watson talks about this, but I think it has a lot to do with railroads. So the process goes from backward linkages to forward linkages. No, it's just that backward linkages and forward linkages are different for cotton than they are for wheat. There are more of them for wheat than there are for cotton. What do I mean backward and forward linkages? I'll just go back over this. Oops. Backward linkages are the things that go into, that are necessities that are used to grow the crop. Forward linkages are the further processing of that crop. Okay. So what that means, and we'll see this hit home especially hard in the 1850s, is that we see northern cities and northern towns. We see much more rapid economic and urban development in the north. And many people reflecting on this and asking, what's the cause of it? And one cause of it is slavery, right? One cause of it is slavery, because you have a relatively small number of buyers who aren't buying as much stuff because you really dampened the demand because you have enslaved people who are doing the labor. But another thing is what's actually produced itself. Cotton is not food. Wheat is food, and wheat has many more forward linkages that tend to build up cities and tend to create more cities because they provide so much food. Over time, food is cheaper in Baltimore than it is in Western Maryland. Why? Because there's this huge market that brings all this wheat from all these different places into the city. This market that tends to drive down the price of wheat in the city, which drives down the price of food in the city, which makes working class people more attracted to the city because food is cheaper. Does that make sense? Cotton doesn't have that. Not until, it's only with Crisco that we get a way of turning cotton into food. Crisco is food that's made from cotton oil. It's not food, it's stuff you fry with. But cotton in general is not a source of food until Crisco, and that's the 1950s, I want to say, 40s and 50s. And so part of it is slavery, and part of it is the staple itself, the central thing that people are growing. The staple is cotton further north, in the south, and wheat further south, and that's everything to do with climate. South, cotton needs 200 continuous frost-free days, and so you can't grow it in Ohio and Indiana. Wheat is kind of a weed and can grow in many places, but it grows easiest in where there are plains, and the plains along the rivers are most valuable. Question about quiz grades. Quiz grades, the grades are already graded, so they should be available on ELC. We'll be able to see. Oh, you guys can't see the quiz 3 grade? Is that right? I'll check. It's possible that it's not. I haven't turned on. I haven't made it visible. I'll look. Okay. Now this tension initially doesn't have that much to do with, it's not going to drive a political wedge necessarily between the North and South. It's just going to mean there's more big cities in the North, and it's going to mean that towns are bigger in the North. It's going to mean there's fewer big cities in the South, and towns are smaller in the South. Over time, though, as people reflect on these changes, and as the second party system starts to crumble, the fundamental difference in the culture and society of these two regions is going to lead to conflict and ultimately civil war. Okay? So again, reviewing possible questions. One would be cause of Panic of 1819. One would be cause of Panic of 1837. One would be, is there a market revolution in the 18 teens and 20s, as Watson said, or is there more of a market revolution in the 1840s? And I'm just going to try to see if I can think of. Yes, so those would be 3 excellent choices for quizzes. So, and I will look through Watson, and I'll cite chapter and verse of Watson about 1819 and 1837, so you can go back and look at it, obviously, but you'll know which pages to look for those 2 panics. And if you want to do the North-South divide, about the market revolution, there's that as well. I will probably do something else connected with these transformations, but when we're talking about this period, this second exam, those are the things that pop out to me as being the real crucial divides between me and Watson. Okay? All right, thanks everybody.
We do have a question about the
Oh yeah, what was the third possible question? Question 1, 1819. Question 2, 1837. Question 3, was there a market revolution? Those are the 3 things that I think occur to me as a market revolution in the 1820s. Did I say that cotton has more backward linkages? No, it has it's about the same, but they're not as many that are bought and sold and sent back to the backwoods, in part because producers are enslaved people who don't buy goods at a store. Yes, the exam is on Friday. Yep. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.